Hi everyone. Let's give it. It seems like people are showing up. So we'll give it just another minute. But it is great to have um, so many folks here joining us today. Happy Monday. uh, my name is Scott Warren. I'm with the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins. Um, I think we're gonna get started right on time because we have all our panelists here, and it seems like people are joining the webinar. So it's great to be with you all today for our session focused on beyond elections, democracy, dignity, and inclusive growth. And so very excited to be with you all today as part of this ongoing series that we've been engaging on Africa and democracy. Um, for today's session, we're going to hear from some fantastic panelists from across Africa. I'm hopeful to start the conversation and then get out of the way. I am based in the U.S., based in the D.C. Baltimore area, although I do have some experience in the African region. I lived in Kenya for many years and have spent time in Southern and East Africa as well. My role as a fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins, I spend a lot of time. Um, the institute is focused on strengthening global democracy in both a U.S. and international context. I spend a lot of time thinking about what can the U.S. learn from the rest of the world. A lot of times, I think the context is what can the U.S. teach, but I think that there's a big desire for what the U.S. can learn, especially at a moment when our own democracy has so many challenges and cleavage lines. And so I'm very excited for the conversation today to learn from some experts, in the Africa region that are that are such fantastic experts at this issue. So we're joined by Samson Itodo, the executive director of Yaga Africa, Dr. Kwesi Mambasa, the economic and social policy lead for Frederick Ebert Stiftung in South Africa, and Narima Wako, the executive director of Siasa Place in Kenya. So I'll have them all introduce themselves in a second. But just to set the stage for the conversation today, I think there's a lot of talk out there about the importance of democracy and how democracy is at risk, and what does it mean for for African countries to focus on democracy. The conversation last week focused on the history of democracy in an African context. Um, there's a very related conversation on uh, why do people trust or not trust institutions, and do people actually believe that democracy is a good thing, and why? There's so much out there just in the sense of um, should people trust democracy just because of the rights that it offers? But what about the economic conditions, and what about the economic growth that does or doesn't necessarily accompany democracy? And I think this is especially important in an African context where you have case studies. You have case studies internationally, like China and Russia. Russia a little less so, but China, which has seen impressive economic growth without democratic opening. You see this in an African context in Rwanda, which I think is a case study of a country which does not necessarily have um, open and free society and open and free elections, but does have impressive economic growth. So why should we be telling people to believe in democracy if other countries out there can have impressive economic growth without necessarily having to worry about democracy? And so this topic, I think we're gonna talk about today is how can we more reliably and sustainably combine economic growth, and not just economic growth, but prosperity and well-being with democracy itself. And that's some of what we'll be going over today is to see if this is possible. This terminology of democracy delivering and does democracy deliver has gained a lot of traction. I'm not entirely sure that that's the right frame of reference, but we'll talk about that. Is that the right frame? Is democracy really important and useful for obtaining economic growth and well-being generally, or are there different frameworks to think about it? And why are Africans in different contexts trusting or not trusting of democracy in the current moment? So that's sort of the opening salvo. We do for this webinar, we have the chat function, and we have you're able to put the Q&A, and so please feel free to ask questions throughout. We also have French translation, so feel free to do that as well. We want this to be interactive, so I'll ask my panelists to respond to the questions, but hopefully respond to each other as well. And so I'm going to start with, and maybe the panelists, as you start, can talk about why this topic interests you. But just the general question: is democracy currently delivering for people in Africa, or maybe it can be in your specific context rather than doing Africa specifically. So Narima, I'll start with you. You introduce yourself and the great work you do, but would love to hear a little bit about, is democracy delivering for Kenya and the people of Africa, and why do you think that this topic is relevant and important right now?
Thank you so much, Scott. It's great to be here. As you mentioned, my name is Nerima, and I'm the director of Siasa Place, and Siasa means politics. So we are a youth organization, and we were formed in 2015, and we are civic tech, which basically means that we do a lot of our engagement hybrid, and we believe in using social media platforms for communications and breaking down the constitution and governance processes and making sure that we articulate these issues on a lot of platforms. So we use a lot of technology with the work that we do, and we work in about 16 counties, which is like 16 states. So the conversation on democracy is really important to us. And Kenya, at the moment, there's a lot happening politically. There's a lot of conversation around the impeachment of our deputy president. And right now, a lot of young people are really charged in terms of what's going on in the country. It wasn't like that last year. And I would say, as far as democracy goes, it's different. It depends on what you define democracy to be. If it's having elections every 5 years like we do, we have them. Do young people trust in the institutions that carry out elections? The answer is no. Even right now, as we speak, the trust in democracy is actually decreasing in Kenya, and I believe that's happening globally. And I say this because we do not have an election boundaries commission. We have it, but it has no commissioners. They should have been replaced. They haven't been. And over the last 2 years, we have about 6 constituencies that should have had by-elections. By-elections because the member of parliament passed on, by-elections because the president decided to appoint some members of parliament to cabinet secretary when he dissolved cabinet and decided to replace individuals in certain dockets. So the huge conversation at the moment is, does voting actually help? When we look at the political parties, many of them do not have young people as actually registered active members. A lot of our political parties are briefcases. We have about 95 at the moment. So many that the registrar of political parties has actually been recorded to say that they would like to reduce the number of parties that are formed, especially after the June 25th protests that happened here. And there've been a lot of conversations about youth wanting to form their own party and it being categorized as being illegal because you cannot form a political party based on a demographic. And so there's someone called Morara Kebaso right now who's become really popular on X, on Twitter, and on TikTok because he has formed a party called Inject. And it's literally a sign of an injection. And they're basically saying that our democracy is sick. It needs to be changed completely. And there are conversations around how do we change the entire system altogether. So to go back to your question, I'm a little bit concerned about the participation of young people. simply because when they look at the current leadership that they have, they don't feel represented at all. When we look at how the impeachment process went, the National Assembly, the Senate, did not listen to the views of the people in terms of people didn't really care about the political um, war that the political class is having. They are caring about their health. Many people don't have access to health. They are caring about education. The cost of education went up. They are caring about opportunities. The jobs are not enough in their country. So they feel ignored. And many of them want to participate, but they feel that the system doesn't allow them to participate. And even when they do participate, they don't have the candidates that they would like to represent them on the ballot. And I'm sure this is similar for the other countries. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam. It's a great, and I was in Kenya a few months ago and saw some of this, and so I have some follow-ups just on what young people are actually looking for, given the frustration that they have in some of these institutions. But let's go to Samson now. Samson, same question to you, just in the sense of do you think that is democracy currently delivering? Do people feel like it is? And why or why not? Would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Please confirm you can hear me.
We can hear you great.
Well, thanks, and thanks to the African Drive for Democracy for this invitation to be part of this discussion. So, Scott, you and I, we've been involved in this discussion for a couple of weeks now, and whether democracy is delivering. I'd just like to premise my reflections on the simplistic definition of democracy, which is democracy is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so at the heart of democracy is about people. So the question is our practice of democracy, in Africa, does it project democracy as government of the people? The stark reality is that in Africa and also in other parts of the world, democracy isn't government of the people. It is government of elites, by elites, and for elites. And it doesn't serve the interests of the people. So to that extent, and like Nerima noted, in terms of representation, the level of representation, not just of young people, but of women, as well as persons with disability, is limited. The second dimension is we've seen across the region where there's this angst, on the part of citizens, because democracy has failed to deliver food on their table, to provide them with security, but more importantly, justice. Because one of the pillars of democracy, is an independent judiciary. But what we have seen is state capture of institutions that should hold political leaders to account. And so the judiciary, is unable to dispense justice to the people. And justice is for those who can afford it. So I would say to that extent, it's not delivering, and the protests that you see, whether it's just indicative of the fact that democracy is, but I wouldn't say that in some aspect, at least we see across the region, this Senegal today, because citizens spoke, they demanded and fought against tenure extension, and they got, to my estimation, they got the leaders that they deserve. And Nerima notes some of the results from the Reject the Finance Bill protest. All of this activism on the part of young people and citizens. So, and this is guaranteed, in a democratic process, that whilst some of this activism and have not delivered sufficient, results, I guess say that, it is really indicative that democracy is partially, safeguarding the rights that citizens do have. But am I content and excited with the progress made so far? I'd say no, but there's clamor for democracy. But it's just the practice of democracy on the continent that requires a lot of overhaul.
And would love to hear a little bit more about that overhaul and what that looks like. It seems like you all are touching on the fact that it's not that people are distrustful of democracy per se, but the types of democracy that they are experiencing in their lives. And so want to hear more on that. But let's go to you, Dr. Kwesi Mambaza. Same question to you. Is democracy delivering? Why or why not?
Okay. Thank you, Scott. And I hope that colleagues can hear me. Am I audible?
We can hear you great.
All right. Okay. Thanks again to colleagues for the invite from Africa Drive. So I want to approach it differently. I want to suggest that I think that democracy is very still relevant on the continent, but also globally. But I think that what citizens and what certain groups in civil society are questioning is a model of democracy, right? And in my view, I think there's a critique of what I would think is a market-led democracy, which on the one hand, and a political and civil liberty perspective guarantees people's access to basic civil and political rights, but on the other hand, reproduces forms of inequality. And I think that that's the real challenge that we face. And I think this speaks to a second point, which is what I want to raise, which is that democracy shouldn't just be state-centric, right, and focus on just what happens within government institutions, but we should ask questions about economic democracy, democracy in the workplace, and democracy in other civil society institutions that go beyond just the state structures. And I think this is the biggest challenge on the continent, but even globally. And I think there are examples like South Africa, for example, where a country is, if you look at most indexes of democracy that look at civil liberties, political rights, freedom of association, South Africa performs quite well. But on the other hand, it underperforms on key socioeconomic indicators. And if you speak to a lot of South Africans, they will argue that for them and their lived experience, democracy hasn't really delivered. So I think the question for us today that we really have to contend with is what kind of model of democracy do we want? And why has democracy not delivered, even in context where you do have the guarantee of these basic political and civil liberties? And I suggest that we need to extend democracy beyond just the state and look at questions around economic democracy, and how also non-state actors also undermine democracy as well, and people's rights and people's access to basic public goods and sometimes even civil liberties. And I think that's how we should approach this question.
Thanks, Kwesi. I really appreciate that framing, and so maybe let's go back and forth with the participants. Nerima, back to you, and maybe going off of Kwesi's point that democracy needs to be more than just elections. I'm curious. You talked about how specifically in Kenya, young people are frustrated. They don't feel like the institutions matter. They're frustrated. So the question is, are they turning away from democracy itself? Are they looking to other forms of government, or is it pushing for a better form of democracy? What do you see as some of the potential ways forward?
So what I do see is a lot of young people using social media to highlight corruption happening in their communities, just basically showing how within their counties, resources that should have gone to save, put up an airstrip or put up a hospital suddenly disappeared. So how they're participating is being concerned with their budgets because they want to be able to see where every shilling has been used, and then asking tough questions. I think our constitution gives a lot of direct power to the people, but people were not really educated as to how they can utilize that power. So public participation is such a huge element in Kenya, in our processes. And even as we speak, there are civil society who are filing a case because public participation wasn't utilized enough when it came to the impeachment of the deputy president. So there's probably going to be a case tomorrow. And so we know that this is working because initially the president had said that he wanted to swear in the deputy president on Friday. So today's our public holiday. He was supposed to be with his new deputy president yesterday at an event. The deputy president was there, but it was interesting that he didn't have the privileges of a deputy president. So technically, if participation wasn't working, he would have already sworn him in without caring what the public says, because the courts basically said, nope, can't swear him in. Public participation, there's a problem with that there. And even how the trial was done, and it was done on live TV for hours. We were sleeping at 11 p.m. for the last 3 days while the impeachment trial was ongoing. So I'd say that's how they're participating. So even when certain decisions are being made by the assemblies, some of these court rulings are virtual. And that's been the beautiful thing about it. There've been youth who have been finding the links to these court hearings and sharing it with their friends. And they come and fill these virtual courtrooms, sometimes 1,000+ people. And then all of them at the same time unmute. And they're like, that's not what we want. That's not what we sent our member of parliament to do. And we've even started this culture of, it's called Msalimie, where it basically means to greet. So where we see a member of parliament doing something wrong, saying something wrong in the house, their number is shared publicly and people message. Some of these guys have gotten up to 20,000, 40,000 text messages and calls, and people pushing their opinions, since these representatives have refused to take the opinions of the public in the spaces that they're supposed to. So I'd say that's how it's changed to this sort of hybrid engagement, which wasn't really foreseen 5 years ago. And it also helps because there are young people who want to be involved, but they're like, do I have to physically go somewhere? Like I have to take time out to go, and I'm not able to do that. So now they're able to do it on their phone wherever they're sitting, and they're feeling like they're engaging in some way. So I would say that as much as some things are still being done, the scandals are still happening, the people are watching. And they're watching because they are deplatformed. And that means that even though they pass these things and the public has said they don't want it to be passed, members of parliament are afraid to go home right now. Many of them can't talk in church. Many of them can't even enter their communities. They're actually chased. And, they're like, why are you coming to speak to us? You're not listening to us. So the good thing is there's a silent conversation about anarchy where we are. There's a slight conversation about 2027. People are waiting for the next election, and they're like, we want to take these guys out. But there's also the challenge of ID suppression. Identity cards are not being distributed, actually. And there's some social listening CSR Place is doing. My team is currently in Kitui County, just asking if people are having a hard time getting their IDs. And we've done this in 6 counties at the moment. And the answer is yes. So we're seeing a deliberate suppression. So even though, government is seeing that young people want to engage, they want to engage with the process, they're trying to slow down the mechanisms as to how they can actually engage. And it's creating this frustration. And you can see the frustration and the kind of, I don't want to call it entitlement, because even concerts are being cancelled. There's a concert where we had Rema in the country, and people just basically ran through the gates. And they're like, I don't understand why I have to pay in a country that when I pay taxes, they don't utilize my money well. So all of us are entitled to get what we want because we see the leadership doing that. And so Oktoberfest at the end of this month has been cancelled because every time there's a gathering of young people, even at the club, it normally ends up with, the president must go. So that energy is still there. If we do not open up these mechanisms where young people can participate, we're going to have a problem very, very soon.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it seems like, I mean, because I think one of the questions, and this is one of the questions in the chat, is that what are the different ways for young people to participate beyond just voting? And so it seems like what's happening in Kenya is that you have people, young people specifically, that are trying to gain power. And so by attending these hearings and the like, they're showing up. And so I guess just a follow up there is how are young people thinking about maintaining and gaining power in addition to elections, right? So how is it something that democracy can be a little bit more? I think some of this goes to Kwesi's point, but how can democracy be something that's not just episodic? Are young people thinking about that in the Kenyan context in terms of the long-term power dynamics as well?
Yes, definitely. They are questioning our systems. They are questioning institutions, like independent institutions, like the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, and why it exists. There are people who have tried to recall members of parliament, basically saying that their member of parliament is not expressing their interest, and gotten signatures, some even thousands of signatures, and submitted them to the Independence and Elections Boundaries Commission. But the challenge is, like I mentioned earlier, we don't have a commission. So even in the letter, the commission says, sorry, we don't have commissioners. There's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do right now. So too bad. You're gonna have to stay with that terrible member of parliament until 2027. So you are seeing young people trying to push the envelope and be like, how can I report things? There's a lot more whistleblowing that's happening, and it's happening in different sectors, from energy to health. Even yesterday, there was a story about one of the largest public hospitals in Nairobi, and the maternity ward is filled with women. Like one woman, it was 4 women sharing a bed, and with 4 kids. So you have 8 people on one bed. And they just recently changed our health insurance, where we're paying more, but the service is less. And so you're seeing a lot more videos on how people are connecting, how mismanagement of public resource and bad governance leads to me struggling in my daily life. Like I can't get access to health. So we're seeing a lot more of those connections that young people are doing on their own, and they're doing it on TikTok.
So looking for those creative ways of being involved and staying engaged, that makes a lot of sense. Samson, would love to go to you. A similar take. You talked about the distinction between people and Africans not necessarily being distrustful of democracy, but more of the type of democracy that they're experiencing. What do you see as some of the ramifications of that? Are people trying to gain power in different ways, or are they looking at alternate sources of government as feasible ways of actually structuring society?
Well, there are 3 dimensions to this. First, I think Afrobarometer tells us clearly that the appetite for democracy in Africa is quite high, that over 70% of Africans clamor for democracy. They are just disenchanted with the type of democracy that we practice, and they are looking for alternatives. Let me begin with the negative alternatives. So you look across West Africa, you see this sort of surge of unconstitutional changes of government or military coups in places like Mali, Niger, Guinea, and all. And it actually shows a troubling trend. When we see people, celebrate on the streets of Niamey, take over by military, they just simply tell us that they are disenchanted with a democratic process that does not deliver, on some of those economic benefits. And for them, they are more concerned about a leadership that can deliver on economic prosperity and economic growth. The big question is whether those institutions, those forms of government are delivering. And I'd say if you speak to people on the streets of Niger, in the streets of Niamey, in Burkina and other countries where they've experienced military takeovers, their life has not been better than when they had a so-called democracy in place. On the other hand, we see, citizens building shadow states, because you have a situation where government exists to deliver security and welfare of the people. But it appears that government has failed in its own responsibility of providing, this sort of basic needs. And in places like Nigeria, you see citizens provide their water, they provide their security, they provide everything. And so they're asking themselves, do we actually have a need for government? Because government isn't delivering on these services. So you just see a creation of shadow states, in different parts of the continent, because people are able to utilize their resources to get, leadership or governance to address some of their needs. One of the things that we're beginning to see in terms of alternatives are things like local governance and decentralization, and more importantly, around deliberative democracy. So we're beginning to see a growth in alternative ways of public deliberation and decision-making. Because if the traditional institutions like parliaments, have failed, to take decisions that advance public interests, and people say they want, I think in all that we see across the continent, people, especially young people, are making a bold statement. They're saying, hey, you this bunch of old and expired politicians, you are not delivering on the promise of democracy. And because you're not doing so, we need alternatives. And if you're not going to provide those alternatives, we are ready, to provide those alternatives ourselves. And this is actually at the heart of this discussion, as you see across different places. But technology and social media is also one tool used by citizens, not just to self-organize, but to make demands on the state. Kenya, Zambia, Nigeria, Ghana recently, you can see how young people are leveraging technology and social media, to not only vent, but to make demands and really articulate recommendations on what needs to change. But as I conclude on this, Court, I think that beyond the fact that citizens are in constant conflict with power structures and elites, I think we need to reflect on the statement citizens are making. And that is traditional forms of governance, traditional forms of democratic institutions, have outlived their use, and it's a great need to think about what new models. It is destroy these institutions and create new ones, and parties. And in my view, I think political parties, have failed as a platform of aggregating social interest of people. Yeah, there are some countries on the continent you can say political parties are still able to amplify citizens' needs. But across board, political parties are just operating as special purpose vehicles for just capturing power and not using power to advance the common good.
Appreciate that, and sort of the exploration for alternative models and why young people and people in general might be drawn to that. Kwesi, I'd love to go to you. You talked earlier about the need for democracy to be more than just elections and for it to be part of everyday life. But sort of going off Samson's point too, where he was talking about we need to look beyond traditional models of democracy. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. Do you think that people in Africa and young people are looking for alternate models, or is it looking for different ways that democracy can be relevant to their own lives? So is this frustration manifesting in looking at alternate models, or are there different ways to be creative in the pursuits right now?
No, I do think that there's an exploration of different models. So if you look at the political level, interesting discussions about how do you create deepened participation by citizens that goes beyond just political parties in democratic institutions and processes. So the role of civil society organizations and things like participatory budgeting and exercising oversight, over political executives in different countries, which I think is also important. Sorry, am I still audible? Oh yes. Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
So I
we
think
can hear you.
So in terms of participation, I think that's quite important. But also, I think there's also deep discussions about this balance that I spoke about earlier on between political rights and civil liberties and economic democracy. So there are interesting ideas about how to organize the economies differently in various countries to address systemic inequality. To address issues around equal access to public goods and public institutions, because that's one key mechanism, I think, for rebuilding faith and trust and democracy as well. And I think it's important to explore these alternatives because they speak to what I spoke about earlier on, which is I think that there's a rejection of a particular model of democracy, which is what I would call a market-led democracy. And then I think there've also been a lot of discussions around policy alternatives to address this inequality that undermines democracy across the continent. These debates
In Kwesi.
include policies around redistribution, issues around implementing economic work as well. And I think all of these, for me, constitutes a good mix of how to rethink and refashion democracy across the continent. But the point I also want to just highlight is that, for me, I think we have to really explore this question of alternatives, of development alternatives, and how they support democracy. And I don't think it's just an African question. Actually, I think it's a global point as well. Because the rise in authoritarian politics, the rise in narrow nationalism, be they ethnic divisions in society, are all fueled by, in my view, the systemic socio-economic inequality.
So can you speak more to? I mean, maybe I'd love to. I know this can be a challenging topic sometime, but turn to a place like Rwanda. Is that type of model appealing to people throughout Africa? Why or why not? When you talk about like taking seriously that other form of development, Kwesi, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you have in mind there.
Yeah, obviously for some it might appeal if one looks at the formal economic indicators like GDP growth, amount of foreign direct investment, and the development of infrastructure. But for others, they would argue that it doesn't appeal to them because you're still dealing with, on the other hand, on the back of that, systemic inequalities, but also you're dealing with a system that doesn't allow for full participation in public life and politics, which in the long run will undermine democracy. And that's why the question about economic development and its supporting democracy is not about just your GDP, your foreign direct investment. It's also about key indicators of human development as well. and how people can have a role in shaping that the way that they function works beyond just elite demands and impulses.
Thanks, Kwesi. I think we might have lost Kwesi. Oh no, there you are. Okay, yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, it is. I think you're right in that there's different aspects that might appeal to different people. So Narima, I'd love to go to you. I mean, you've been talking about the Kenyan context, and I sort of form of the same question. When we look at alternatives like Rwanda that might be providing economic gains, is that something that's appealing to Kenya? And I guess the other way of thinking about it is, are the demands, when we think about what democracy can deliver, are the demands about, I think a lot of it's about jobs and economic gains. How much of that is tied into rights? How much do people say we just, whatever gives us jobs gives us, we need that, versus looking at a more holistic definition of democracy?
That's a good question, because our president has been trolled online and basically been told that he is shipping Kenyans out of Kenya. And a lot of Kenyans do not want to leave home. And they keep insisting that when it comes to the opportunities, if the environment can be made more conducive instead of these bilateral agreements that he's been getting into. And I remember sometime earlier this month, late last month, they signed the Germany-Kenya bilateral agreement, which, highlighted on TV and our national papers that it would provide 250,000 jobs to semi-skilled workers. And it brought a huge hullabaloo in Germany, and even Kenyans in Germany really frustrated because of what's going on politically there in regards to immigration, and them wanting to reduce, Africa's migration and having stricter boundary policies. And, Kenyans just saying he's made things worse for us. And even, Germany announcing that they actually stopped processing visas for Kenyans. And, even the way it was communicated, a lot of the opportunities, many of them are supposed to be digital, so that Kenyans can work for these UK, Germany companies because of, English. He's really trying to front Kenya as being this Silicon Savannah and focusing on technology. So to go back to your point, a lot of US corporations are actually not treating workers well in Kenya. In fact, we don't even have regulatory frameworks for social welfare, for minimum pay standards. And we technically, as CSR Place, deal with former workers of US corporations for digital platforms who have been going through mental breakdowns. And there's actually a case here in Kenya with Meta that has been running for almost 2 years. And Meta has ignored court orders where they have basically been told by the courts to pay these people because they have underpaid them, overworked them, and sometimes in conditions that are close to slavery, where they're not allowed to leave rooms, they have to sit, they're only allowed to stand up if they need to go pee. And then some of the content that they're exposed to is the worst in the world. And then they don't have any psychosocial support. So we are seeing where our government is pretty much opening to any and every job. And even most recently, there's the case of Lebanon, where, videos of Kenyans trying to flee Lebanon and stuck in Lebanon, and even the abuse of workers. And, there was a huge uproar. And then I saw recently in the papers, the government saying that they have tried to evacuate Kenyans and they have refused to come for evacuation. So I don't know how real that is. So as we speak, there's a huge conversation, yes, around the economy. Yes, we recognize unemployment is high. And because we have a very educated population, the professionalism is there. But there's also this mismatch in terms of the kind of skill that government is enhancing or supporting and encouraging young people to apply for. So we have the National Employment Authority, where it's also the state agency. As a young person, if you're looking for employment, you log on and you look for jobs there. And most of those jobs are for housekeepers, for watchmen, cooks, drivers, and the president is constantly telling people to go on this website, apply on this website, and you're seeing people being like, the kind of jobs, the kind of pay, and then we have to leave our families, and then even though we send our resources to the diaspora back, we're not able to see it being fed into the economy. We're seeing a lot of corruption occurring. So I'll say the bigger issue for us is the environment for business. There's been higher taxes, and that tax has increased incrementally over the last few months. And that's just because of instances, the kind of certificates that you need to start a business, for instance, almost makes it difficult for especially young people to start one. They don't even have the capital. And then they have found of very clever ways to tax. So if you have a shop on Instagram, if you have a shop on Facebook, they're finding ways to tax you to be able to be, taxed on those platforms. And so Meta was also in the country, and Kenya was chosen to be one of the first countries to be able to do or to be paid content creators in Kenya through Meta. And so they're really trying to think through ways of how do we create this environment for young people to have opportunities, but government is not discussing how do we protect the citizen. A lot of these companies, the political leaders do sit on the boards. We have very famous president's sons who sit on the board of Uber, for instance. And so they do have a stake. And so you can even see how they're utilizing their positions of power, again, to be able to benefit from the citizens themselves. And right now, there's a conversation around the digital labor bill. There's a conversation around a content creators bill, because a lot of content creators, a lot of these companies have unfairly paid or utilized algorithms to unfairly pay Kenyans and Africans in general. So that's a huge conversation on its own at the moment.
That's really interesting. Thanks for that. And I'm curious because you talked about some of the challenges here. It seems like it's you have African governments, but you also have these big, international corporations that are usurping power too. Most of them coming from the West. And so I'm curious how much of the sentiments towards democracy itself, and maybe the terminology can be problematic in some cases, stem from an anti-West perspective. How much is democracy associated with the West, and how much does that perspective lead into how people are feeling about the process itself? Miriam, if you want to tackle that too.
Well, it's complicated because we have been trying to highlight these issues, and of course, most of the trolling we would get would be, as even if they're being paid a little, at least they're getting some form of money. And because we're talking about a desperate population, and what a lot of the public don't understand is a lot of these corporations target young people who are underprivileged. They actually do a questionnaire and make sure that you're the first kid in your family to go to some form of higher education. So they understand the psychology of black tax and how important it is for you to have even some form of employment. So that aspect of it, the public doesn't understand. So a lot of the work is around narrative and understanding the value chain and understanding who this worker is and where they come from and why we're concerned. Because these individuals, for instance, in the Meta case, it's because they were trying to form a union. They felt that these issues, honestly, we need to be able to protect ourselves. We need some form of collective bargaining. And over 180 people were fired immediately and blacklisted. Things that, as a citizen in Kenya, you cannot do under the Employment Act. But because they work for digital platforms, they are not considered to be employees, and they work under these medium companies. So there's also complexities within that. And when it comes to democracy, I can talk about even, political micro-targeting. You'll remember Cambridge Analytica and how a lot of these narratives shaped Kenyans in voting in 2017, and then it happened in the US. And a lot of people right now are worried about artificial intelligence and how it's affecting the US election. But we were dealing with that. We dealt with that in 2022. And it's on platforms like TikTok that at that time were like barely 4 years old. And they're growing so quickly. And why this is important is because African countries speak diverse languages. And a lot of times when it becomes toxic, conversations on democracy, representation, elections, we tend to speak about these things in our dialects. That's where you have nicknames for certain communities, nicknames for certain tribes, which are not in English. And they are linked to our tribal contexts. And so when you have, companies like Meta not investing in content moderators, these are the people who sift through Meta and basically look at the content and flag whether it's toxic or not. If you have one person representing Namibia, it's crazy. You're not expecting them to help. You're not expecting them to do anything. And so one of the cases in Ethiopia is because a content moderator based here in Kenya flagged that there was a post written in Amharic that was actually threatening a professor who was really speaking against the civil war. And they had talked about going to his house and targeting him. And he flagged this. He said, this is a problem. We need to flag this. This man's life is in danger. And they did take it seriously, and that professor was killed. And that matter is currently in court. So it shows you how it also affects our democracies, our freedom of expression, what's toxic or not. And these companies not taking our languages seriously, yet because most of our populations are young, and a lot of them, those are the spaces they congregate and speak, is not being seen as a threat or a market. And these are the things that a lot of organizations at the moment are questioning and pushing back to hold social media platforms accountable for.
That's fascinating. I mean, thank you for that. I didn't know all that, and that sort of speaks to how there might not be full investment in the continent, in terms of its democratic development, and it's more how can it serve the interests of others. Sims, I'd love to go to you. Is Samson still there? It looks like Samson might have fallen off. So we'll go to I'm just making sure. Yeah, we'll go to Kwesi. So Kwesi, I'd love to I mean, sort of similar theme to go to you. But maybe it's you talked a little bit about this, but I'd love to sort of nail it on the head a little bit more of can economic growth be sustainable and meaningful without corresponding political freedoms and social justice? So is it possible to actually obtain economic growth without democracy? Or do the two have to be linked, specifically thinking about African context? And as you answer that, I know that there's a few questions in the chat, so please keep them coming. And we'll start to go to those questions after this. You're on mute, Kwesi.
It's not sustainable in the long run, because if we're moving from the premise of economic democracy, we're also realizing that part of building part of building economic democracy is also allowing citizens to fully participate and determine what are their development priorities, what are their development needs, and be able to hold both private and public sector actors accountable over time. So for me, it's not sustainable. And I actually think there is sort of sometimes a fictitious line that's drawn between political and socio-economic rights in debates about democracy, which is not helpful. And this is why I think, I mean, the historical work that's been done around this link between poverty and development, or inequality development, is helpful, because it shows us the link between the two. So I really think it's important to have rather a wider conception of democracy that balances these different forms of liberties or rights and freedoms, rather than trying to go for one or the other. Yeah, that's.
Thanks, Kwesi. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Do you have I think you're right in sort of that wider spectrum. Do you have specific examples of where you think that that's happened effectively in recent contexts, where that you have countries that have balanced that and sort of thought about the distinction or the combination between economic and democratic freedoms?
Yeah, well, I think there are some interesting examples across the globe. I think the Brazilian example and the leadership of Lula was quite interesting, because there, yes, you had a lot of emphasis on redistributive socio-economic policies, but they were coupled with the idea of improving citizen participation over determining developmental priorities, oversight over how development programs are run, and the likes. So I think that's one could draw lessons from those from that particular tenure as well. Even historically, I mean, if one looks at the development, and not only historically, but also in the contemporary over the state of Kerala in India, some interesting examples there that one can also draw from. So those are the ones that come to my head. I mean, in South Africa also, you do have the structures of the institutions that are supposed to basically balance those two, let's say, pillars of democracy. But whether that has been successful or not is subject to debate. But you do have examples of participatory budgeting processes, processes where there's supposed to be civil society participation and developing and creating development priorities and the likes. But there's a debate around whether that's produced the intended policy goals or outcomes.
Do you just one more question on that, but when you're thinking about participatory budgeting and you think about those outcomes, can you talk a little bit more about like what you see? Are those types of participatory measures getting through to enough people? Like, is that coming through? Like, when you see it working or not, when you have more of these participatory measures, why do you think it's working, or what do you think some of the challenges are?
That the screen froze. Sorry, just that last question.
No worries. Can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry, I just missed that last question. The screen froze.
Oh, no worries. When you think about participatory budgeting or some of those participatory measures, like what's working and what are some of is that getting through to enough people? When you talked about some of the challenges of those participatory measures, what do you see as some of the benefits of that and the potential, and what do you see as some of the limitations?
Yeah, so for example, in South Africa, you have the integrated development plans at the local level, and there's a whole rights framework around the role of citizens participating in those processes. But at the same time, in those processes, you have a state that is sometimes constrained by macroeconomic policies, choices, and fiscal constraints. And so even when citizens do identify certain priorities and certain issues to take forward, there's always a limitation around budgets. And I think this is why I circle back to this idea of we need to ask like deeper questions about, do we have the correct fiscal policy frameworks that allow
I think Kwesi's breaking up a little
for
bit.
those priorities that identify constrained by choice.
Thanks, Kwesi. I think we got the gist of it. But you broke up a little bit there at the end, but we'll come back to you. Samson, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can. Can you
Okay.
hear me? Yeah, because
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you
went
great. I was looking to you earlier and
yeah.
you went off. So I'm wondering, maybe to go here. You've talked a little bit about the different structures and what might be appealing to people and what some of the challenges might be about democracy. What do you think are arguments that can be made to everyday people on the continent about why democracy matters to their lives? people that might be skeptical or saying that it's not, not worth it, or we need to focus on jobs and the economy over everything else. What are some of the arguments that can be made to people on why democracy can matter to their lives?
First, I think that this question is very important in view of certain narratives that need to change about democracy. One of the sort of issues people have with democracy is the time it takes for public decision making. That democracy wastes a lot of time, unlike authoritarianism, where there's centralization of power. And I wanted to contribute to that discussion about Rwanda. There is, a great need to spend time to listen to everyone before decisions are made, because that's what inclusion is about. You need to take on every contribution. However, at the end of the day, it's not every contribution or every input that will be captured in the final decision. And so I think that we need to encourage people to say that, yes, while you have there's sort of investment in ensuring that decisions, are made that are reflective of the people. What it seeks to do is to provide an opportunity where your voice is heard, and it's not just a voice of people who have residue of political power, but that inclusion is necessary, for quality decision making. I think the other point is that democracy, provides long-term benefits, that you can have a Rwanda, with appealing economic success, efficient governance, to some extent, you see some level of stability. But the question is whether that is sustainable. And people need to look at, what are the long-term benefits. And what democracy actually does is that it ensures that people, experience long-term benefits, that it's not short-term in nature. And that democracy can put food on your table if you make the right choices. And I think this is where it is really important, that it can put food on the table. It can provide security if you make the right choices. That's why we need to be actively involved, in the democratic process, and that democracy isn't just about elections, that the work of making democracy deliver for you begins right after elections. And I'd say lastly, in terms of why democracy actually matters, to people in addition to the economic benefits, is the point about freedom. And that freedom is non-negotiable. And people need freedom to be able, to express and contribute to national development, and that democracy guarantees the freedom that everyone needs to enforce their rights, because they are inalienable rights that they have, and they can only enjoy that right within a democratic framework, because other forms of government tend to curtail these rights, and that rights are equally important because they've been given to us, by God, and democracy guarantees that. So for you to speak, to use your voice, you need to ensure that those rights are guaranteed. I think that these are some of the narratives, if propagated, can really help citizens renew their faith in democracy, and also engage, because democracy only delivers when people are engaged.
I think that engagement point is is very important, and that point of long-term gains, I think, is very important too. So appreciate you raising those. I'm going to go to some of the audience questions. So feel free to keep them coming. Narima, this question that's in the chat, would love to hear about how some of these policies, I mean, when we think about democracy, when we think about economic and social policies, and Samson was getting at this a little bit too, but how can they cater to the needs of more marginalized groups? So how do we make sure that marginalized groups are a part of this conversation, whether it's youth and women, LGBTQ communities, those who face systemic opportunities? How can those people be front and center in these issues about democratic participation?
I think that's a great question. It's also something that's difficult. I wouldn't say it's easy to do because we have had to intentionally center our conversations around marginalized. So that would mean even having meetings and engagements at the grassroots and being completely intentional and specific about the representation, inclusion, and about the numbers. A lot of times it's a checkbox, you know, and I'm sure this happens in a lot of countries where they say, yeah, we engage the youth, and there's this tokenistic young person that they just check a box and say, yes, the youth were engaged. And that has meant that we have our own kind of parallel forms of engagement. So we have barazas, which are basically like village meetings, like town halls. Some people call them town halls. And we do normally work with local community-based organizations or organizations that work with marginalized communities to organize these meetings. And we invite the leadership to these meetings so that now they become the center of the conversation, and then they want to do the invitation, and then they're the ones who are be able to articulate the issues. Before they were not attending, before they didn't find it important, but then as they grew over time, we now have a certain level of respect where a lot of like members in the assemblies realize that the people who engage with these groups are the ones who end up getting re-elected, and the people who don't end up not winning the election again. So that sort of momentum has taken time to do, but people can now see the difference of the importance of inclusion. But I would say where we're struggling in Kenya, as much as we have affirmative action in our constitution, which basically Article 100 pushes for marginalized communities, which is youth, women, PWDs. And there's a certain ratio of representation that has to happen in every board, every position. In fact, by the time appointments are made, questions come up, people look at the representation, and if they don't see it, civil society sue. And there have been cases where civil society has sued and won. So it has built this rapport that you have to have that representation. But where I say we're struggling is we still have the issue of criteria, where we still have people's relatives picking up certain positions and then them taking it as representation and inclusion, when we can all see that that's somebody's relative daughter or someone's family member. And those are the things that we're pushing back on in terms of representation. So it's not perfect. The public still doesn't quite understand why it's necessary. So there's still a lot of education that is required and still happening. And also to be able to measure, are we gaining? So we have the women representative seats. And when we have young women who want to go into politics, they're often pushed to that position. They're told, don't go for member of parliament, you already have women rep, and sort of pushed there. And statistically, from our last elections in 2017, when we talk about young women, how many were elected below the age of 35? We only had about 15. And then in 2022, we have 17. So you can see that increment over 5 years is 2 additional people. When we look at governors, for instance, at the moment, Kenya has 7 female governors, while in the previous election, we had 4. So you're seeing those increments are very small, they're minute. And why I say they're minute is because when you compare young men below the age of 35, I'm looking at the lowest level to be elected in the County Assembly. We had 303 elected below the age of 35. And so there are states in our counties where we have 1 elected woman for 85 positions. And that's Kitui. Nairobi only has 4. And so what happens is the top up where they now nominate. And like I said, the nominations make it more difficult for our work just because of the kind of people that they're nominating. So there's work to be done there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And just the stark levels of how much more work has to be done. So that there's some that's put into to put into place, but think that that's really important because we can't get people to to believe in democracy if we're only catering to people that already have power. We're not thinking about those marginalized populations too. Kwesi, I'd love to sort of take that same type of question to you with a little bit of a twist. So thinking about how marginalized groups can better participate, but additionally, and you've talked a little bit about this, curious how some of these democratic institutions can evolve to restore public trust. And so, what are ways that you talked a little bit about participatory budgeting? I think that's promising, but obviously has its limitations right now too. What are different ways that some of these institutions can evolve to breed trust? And again, for attendees, if you have any other questions, we're running short on time, so feel free to put them in the chat.
Yeah. So let me first, on this point about representation, I think it's also important to remember, and this is often stated, that yes, of course, the question around age and demographics is important to the youth, but we need to be careful sometimes, because sometimes we assume that the youth are a homogeneous group, and that's not necessarily the case. So we need to cater also for different class, cultural, but even ideological backgrounds of young people. Because sometimes the youth can be part of the elites and can be part of elite formation. So I think that's important. I think what's interesting for me around the youth question is what are the innovative ideas around governance, around development that this generation is bringing to the fore. And I think that's more useful than just speaking about the youth and just representation only demographically. So I just wanted to make that point. And then the issue around public trust and public goods. So for me, I think the point that I was trying to sort of highlight there was that one of, I think, the fundamental causes of undermining democracy on the continent has been this loss in the faith in public goods, which I think is central to rebuilding trust in democracy. And I think why the public goods have waned is because of the policy choices that have been undertaken by governments over the past years. Some of them have been self-inflicted, governments themselves, but also, let's be honest, there's also been pressure from international financial institutions to take those choices. So for me, one of the avenues of sort of building public goods and building faith in democracy on the back of those public goods is to reassert the role of the state and citizens in maintaining public goods, rather than supporting this sort of knee-jerk or response to informal networks to addressing public problems and institutions. So that's one of the key points that I was trying to make around this idea of public goods, and trust, and how you build trust around that. Because obviously, when you rebuild public goods, you automatically need citizen participation. You automatically need citizen oversight, right? And I think those are important components of democracy. And then you're more likely to also break down some of the social divisions that are created by the loss of this faith in public goods and institutions.
What do you think of the balance between, if you talk about having a bigger state that can, think about, the provision of public goods, but if people don't trust the state to do so, how do you think about the state having a bigger role, but at the same time, people don't trust the state to actually deliver?
Yeah, because you have to connect the two. You have to first ask the question, what informs state failure? And for me, some of what we see as just pure corruption and patronage isn't based on that. So, for example, if you look at the public provision of health services, it comes on the back of budget cuts that then erode people's faith, okay? But then that also has to be combined with participatory processes that allow citizens to then say, this is what these public institutions should be prioritizing. So that you balance sort of the fiscal argument with the participatory element. And as I said, I don't know a lot about the intricacies of other constitutional and rights frameworks in other countries, but in South Africa, there's a lot of space for that. And I think that's the direction we should be heading, rather than either informal networks, patronage, or increased privatization in the South African context, which just basically divides society more.
Yeah, I appreciate that focus on thinking about participatory measures in terms of that as well. Samson, to go to you, you were talking about sort of this notion of shadow states at the beginning, providing providing goods and services for people that have become more distrustful of democracy. So I'm curious, sort of going off of Kwesi's point, if we can go to you, which is, how do you think we rebuild trust in institutions? So what's the best way to do that?
I think first, the only way we can rebuild trust in institutions is if those institutions begin to deliver and advance the common good. That's the only way. You can have a situation where the judiciary legitimizes flawed elections and expect people to trust the judiciary. You can have a situation where the judiciary, does not deliver justice, to human victims of human rights violations, and expect that, citizens are going to trust the judiciary. No, the judiciary used to be the bastion of hope for the common man. But now it does seem to pose a huge threat to the common man, especially in places like Nigeria and other countries where we've seen justice traded, on the altar of legal technicalities. The second, point is transparency. If you want to inspire public trust, then public institutions have to be transparent. Parliaments have to be transparent about voting records, about positions taken by legislators on issues of governance, and things around proactive disclosure, can really inspire public confidence in our public institutions, because you can't run an opaque system and expect that the public will trust you. Because when we think about trust isn't blind. People want to see, people want to feel. I think one other ways we can inspire public trust is consistent engagement with the public. And whether it's through town hall meetings, whether it's through media engagement, there's a great need to constantly engage with critical stakeholders. So if a policy is going to be formulated, there's need to invite contributions from stakeholders, and not just invite contributions, but from stakeholders, but also demonstrate how their input is making a difference. Because often we've seen window dressing across different parts of the continent where the notion that, yes, civil society were consulted before a particular policy was passed is enough legitimizing tool. But that is not the case. And what people want more, and I think that's the point the citizens are making, that they want more, that the current so-called dividends or the proceeds or results is not enough, given the investments that people make. I think all this will inspire trust on the part of citizens. But trust is also a two-way street. That there are times where the state does all that I have highlighted, but citizens, as a result of this deeply entrenched distrust, are unable to shift position on certain policy issues, even when policy or when democratic institutions have been open and transparent. And I think that as we talk about the state, there's also the responsibility on the part of citizens, where they've seen appreciable progress and transparency from public institution. I think they should, they should express, some trust and give policy makers and also public leaders a benefit of doubt. Because I dare say that despite the challenges, despite the gaps, there are still transformational leaders in public office. There are still institutions who want to serve the people and advance the common good. It's just that this sort of systemic rot seem to have overwhelmed those institutions, and we have to, consistently demonstrate commitment and support to helping those institutions deliver.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and the notion of it as a two-way street, I think, is really important, and how citizens actually participate in that process. We're short. We have about just or 10 minutes left, but I'm curious. There's been a few audience questions, but anyone else from the audience have a question or want to weigh in on the proceedings? I'll give it a second just to see if folks raise their hand or type anything in the chat or the Q&A, but would love to to hear from any reflections that folks have. Not, I have a few follow-up questions. Okay, well, feel free to raise hand or put anything in the chat or the Q&A. I'm monitoring that. But I'm curious, maybe as we start to wrap up, I mean, this is a little bit of a selfish question for me, but I sort of noted at the beginning that, you know, one of the things that I find is interesting is you know, too many of these conversations on democracy are led with a Western frame. So obviously I'm in the West, but I think it's been very useful to hear the perspective, you know, from folks from East, West, and South Africa today. I'd be curious what the West can learn from Africa at this moment in terms of democracy. So rather than the other way around, what are some of the lessons that we can think about learning from what's happening across the continent? So maybe Narima, if we start with you on any lessons that we can learn from Africa.
Yeah, sure. I think this one it has pros and cons, and I would say that even in our politics, councils of elders are normally quite involved, and even when we work with communities, the chiefs still play a very important role in terms of issues in the community and also mediation. Even though they are not recognized or elected in the constitution, etc. And I think why this is important is because in our last election, we had a lot of youth appreciate the Council of Elders, which unfortunately is mostly men. That's why I say it's a pro and a con. And so there is older men who are recognized by the community to be able to make sound decisions on behalf of the community. And in some areas, they will select who should lead. And in some places, they're quite sober. And so a lot of young people got elected because the Council of Elders trusted in the youth. And so there are some communities where you can never see marginalized communities leading because of that Council of Elders. So I say it's give and take, and that's also where negotiated democracy comes in. I think it emphasizes on dialogue, it emphasizes on understanding context, on background and reasoning, especially in areas where it's reasonable. I've seen amazing women elected through this Council of Elders.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think one of the things that there is this notion, even in the West, of what the balance is between citizen participation and some type of gatekeeping too, where you have folks that make sure that you know, things don't go too far off the you know, off the railing, for lack of a better way of saying it. And that Council of Elders is really an interesting way of thinking about it. Kwesi, same question to you. What are things that that we can potentially learn from Africa in this moment right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first one is, and I've alluded to this earlier on, is the reality that if the state and public institutions basically fail to protect citizens against the dictates of like a market-led development model, it undermines democracy in several ways. And I don't think this, yeah, as I said, I don't think this is just unique to our context. I think it's happening even in parts of the West. But I think that's the first thing. I also think that, you know, it would be interesting to also go back to some of the key writers from the continent who've been critiquing this Western model of capitalism and how it affects democracy. So people like Nabudere, Amin, and the others. And I think it's important because I do think we really have to rethink this link between democracy and development, and how that relates to the structuring of the economy. And then I also think there are a lot of interesting models around traditional or historic community participation. They come from the continent. And in some cases, they've been infused even into like the modern constitutions and how they function, like in the South African context. And I think that's something important around decentralized participation and protecting yeah, protecting people's power, if I was to use a political term. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that decentralized power and just how much, I mean, there is, and I know this happened a little in the conversation last week, but how much there is a history of democracy in the continent. I think that that's a really important point, and that this isn't something that is a Western concept. Samson, to you, what are lessons that that we can learn from the African context?
Well, I think the West can learn quite a bit from the African context. First, in relation to public participation and decision making at the local level, there's a lot of citizens organizing at the community level that I think the West can learn about this sort of mechanics of organizing at the local and community level. And you can find that whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Rwanda, including Kenya as well. So that's something to learn. The second is about resilience, and that the fact that we have all these challenges on the continent, there are still countries and democracies that are still standing because of citizens' activism. We talk about Gambia today. In fact, recently in Senegal, how effective organizing repelled attempts to subvert the constitution. And so the West can really learn resilience, citizens' resilience to authoritarianism or capture of institutions. I think the last sort of good lesson that the West can learn is what young people are saying from the streets, using their phones, and also building strong alliances with different institutions. I think that organizing model is one that requires a bit of reflection, but also adoption of some of those practices. And like Afrobarometer also said, that Africans love democracy. Africans want more democracy. They don't want authoritarian rule. Unlike other countries where data shows that the appetite for democracy is very low, we on this continent actually love democracy. So I think that is something that the West can also learn, and I'm quite happy that the way you frame the question clearly shows that the West is humble to learn, because most of the discourse about democracy, it's the West telling Africa how to practice democracy and benchmarking some of Africa's evolution or political evolution based on certain dictates defined by the West. So I think this humility is great, that really recognizes that even prior to the conquest in Africa, there were sort of inclusive decision-making processes at the traditional level. And some of them are not antithetical to democratic practices, but they really strengthen, and reinforce some of those democratic principles. Over.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Samson, and hopefully that's something that the rest of the West is thinking about too. Just I think that there's so much that we can learn from you all, and I learned from all of our fantastic panelists here, Samson Itolo and Narima Wako, Kwesi Mambasa. You all were fantastic. Appreciate the audience's participation, and this was recorded as well. So know that we'll have another session next week. But thank you all for taking the time to talk about this notion of democracy, dignity, and inclusive of growth, and thinking about democracy beyond elections. And I wish you all a good and relaxing and good and peaceful and productive rest of your week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.